Hello, and welcome to Play Disc, the musical podcast where we analyze full albums. My name is John Porterville,
I'm Harrison Porabill.
and this is our very first episode. You excited, Harry?
Yeah, kind of. Also a little nervous, but hey, we'll get into it.
All right. What we're going to do here is take a close whole album view of one particular album as selected by one of us. We're taking turns. So this week, our first episode, Harrison, you got the first pick.
Our first episode this week is going to be focusing on Linkin Park's debut album, Hybrid Theory.
All right.
Yeah, the reason I sort of wanted to pick this is, I wanted something kind of, broad, recognizable, that, most people are at the very least familiar with. And also something that, for our first episode, if I looked back and thought about it, that I wouldn't necessarily regret not quite doing right. That's sort of my main motivation. And also, Hybrid Theory is kind of important to me. I'm a 90s kid. I was in elementary school when it came out, and I kind of hadn't heard anything like it before, so it's kind of formative for me. Linkin Park is sort of my age group's closest thing to Nirvana.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can hear that for sure. So just as a little bit of cultural context, what was Linkin Park different from that was out and popular when you first heard them?
I mean, at the time, there did seem to be this, pretty strict divide between pop music, rock music, and rap music.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, pop was all boy bands and power pop acts like, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, etc. They were kind of on the downswing at the time, but that was the biggest thing. Eminem was really first getting big, and rap was either trying to sound exactly like that or trying to make itself as distinct as possible. And the Foo Fighters were still chugging along with rock music at the time, and Nickelback was about to get started up. Or actually, no, they might have been active at the time. But nothing really seemed to properly mix all of that together. And while I didn't really have much of a grasp of hard rock at the time, I do remember the first time I heard One Step Closer. And I'm sure it sounds like a lot of stuff that was out at the time, but just due to the virtue of my upbringing, I had never heard anything like it, and it captivated me from note one.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it was, and One Step Closer, as the first single of this
Kind
album.
of the most generic song on the album.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's not really representative of what we hear on the rest of it. For instance, Mike Shinoda's not on that song at all, I don't think.
Nope.
Or at least his vocals aren't.
I think he's got some, refrains in the background, but yeah.
So, let's back this up and provide a little context. Linkin Park, they were a rock, rap, kind of heavy metal-ish band, and this was their debut album. It came out in October of the year 2000. The primary members of the band that most people know of are Chester Bennington, who was the lead singer and songwriter, and Mike Shinoda, who was the keyboardist, producer, and rapper, right?
I would also mention Joe Hahn.
Yes.
Doing producing and turntables.
Mr. Hahn gets his own showcase song here. The other members were Rob Borden, Brad Delson, Dave Farrell, who were there, but they're not household names the way the other three guys are.
I was actually kind of surprised when I started doing research and sort of realized just how many incarnations of Linkin Park there were before Linkin Park.
Ah, yes. For instance, the name...
And also that Chester Bennington was actually the last addition to the band.
Oh, yeah.
Because, he's kind of the star of the band. He's front and center in all their promotion.
They're not... they've broken up now that he's dead, right?
Yeah, no, I think they're still working. Oh. Yeah, since his suicide, Shinoda has sort of seemed to take over that role, which they kind of traded off a bit.
Okay.
But yeah, that was sort of something that surprised me that he was the last person to be added to the band, and he kind of seemed to solve their little like genre melting pot thing.
Oh, that is really interesting. I didn't know that either.
Hmm.
So before he came in, would it be safe to say that the band was more rap and hip hop focused?
Well, they had a singer
Oh,
before.
okay. And I know that the name of this album, Hybrid Theory, comes from the what used to be the name of the band. That they changed the name of the band, but then made that the title of their first album.
Right. But yeah, their original singer was a guy named Mark Wakefield, and there was a short gap where they didn't seem to have a singer.
Is
I'm guessing it was just Mike Shinoda doing all the
I guess
vocals,
so.
and then Chester Bennington came up. And honestly, one of the things I find kind of interesting is that prior to Bennington's suicide last year, well, a year and a half ago at this point, he the band has been fairly continuous since then. Like, there's no membership shakeups.
That is interesting, but they've also not been especially prolific. What was it? 5 albums over 15 years?
Uh, 7
7 albums.
over 17.
Okay, well, kind of a wash on the on the average there. So, how do you want to actually discuss the album holistically? Do you want to go track by track?
Um, the main thing for me, I mean, I guess a good way to do this would just sort of be to literally talk about our experience of listening to the album.
Sure, sure.
So not necessarily track by track, but just sort of, the feeling of that first listen, I guess would be the way to put it.
All right. So you're talking autobiographical from the first time you heard the album when you were young?
Oh, no, no, no. I mean, like, when I was listening to it for the show.
Okay, because I'm not entirely sure if I ever did listen to this album all the way through when it was new. I thought I did, but when I was listening for this
That's
project, there were some songs that I just didn't remember, that I wasn't familiar with at all. Um,
that's interesting. Yeah, that's not actually what I meant. Although it is kind of cool because, like, this album definitely I add it to my, like, just passive doing stuff
uh-huh.
playlists, once or twice a year. And even when I was like finally giving it a good hard critical listen this time around, I was like, man, I don't remember this.
Yeah, that's funny how music can do that to you. And we'll have a lot of talking about that, I'm sure, with future albums when we're covering albums that we're very familiar with. But sometimes it's
Hmm.
the ones that you don't remember until your 95th listen that become kind of your favorite track because they still have the most novelty in your mind.
Yeah. But yeah, the main thing that really stuck out to me about the album as I was listening to it was it's really good, and it is definitely a whole contiguous single album. But the thing that really struck me about it is it really feels like three shorter EPs just kind of stapled together. Like Papercut, One Step Closer, With You, and Points of Authority are all a really good
Mm-hmm.
mini album. Crawling, Runaway, By Myself, and In the End are kind of a really good middle. And Place for My Head, Forgotten, Cure for the Itch, and Pushing Me Away are all a really good capstone. Like, they all feel like three separate acts of the same album.
That is interesting because you've never told me that, and yet when I did my listen, sometimes I would do piecemeal and pick up the album in the middle, and Place for My Head was often the place where I would start.
I think you and I both kind of have. I'm suspecting this, I don't know, but I get the feeling you and I both have a slight problem with In the End because, at least for me, I assume for you as well, back in 2001, In the End was
It was
everywhere.
definitely overplayed. I don't have a problem with it today because I went probably 14 years without hearing it. I mean, it was a huge hit, but it doesn't come up on the radio these days.
Yeah, it's really weird because listening to that middle part of the album was like kind of cringeworthy for me. Because one, I remember as a kid really liking
Hmm.
Crawling. Like I remember really enjoying that song. And like listening to Crawling, Runaway, By Myself, and In the End, like all just in a sequence. It was like a one, two, three, four punch of just cringe.
That's funny because, well, Personally, I really liked By Myself. I I think it goes maybe like half a step deeper than a lot of more sophomoric lyrics about self-doubt, in that it touches on how alienating it can feel to not be able to rely on yourself or your own judgment. I thought that was an interesting lyrical approach, and I think the song is pretty strong for it. On the other hand, Crawling, I agree with you. I don't think it's held up as well.
Yeah, I think it had that like kind of the draining sound effects being incorporated into it. I think really resonated with me as a kid.
Oh, the...
And yeah, and I'm not sure why, but yeah, I really liked Crawling as a kid, and I don't know what was wrong with me 18 years ago.
That is a cool production trick, and I don't know if that's Shinoda or Mr. Han responsible for that bit of soundcraft there, but it does certainly give the song a more holistic feel and made it viable as a single, when maybe Bennington's work on the song was not pulling its weight there. For instance, the lyrics of the chorus, "Crawling in my skin, these wounds they will not heal. Fear is how I fall, confusing what is real."
The sad thing is that's not even the worst lyrics on the album, in my opinion.
Maybe not. Maybe not. But I will say that's pretty middle school. For the benefit of our listeners, I attended a high school program for creative writing. I wanted to be a poet or a fiction writer for a good part of my life. And at some point around college, I kind of lost interest in those, but I'm still a songwriter myself, and I'm still a lyricist. So I have an over-calibrated sense of lyricism when I'm listening to songs like this. And when I hear "Crawling in my skin, these wounds they will not heal," what I'm thinking is, what wounds? Why? What's going on? There needs to be some kind of point of something to compel us. And especially for Crawling, that song opens on the chorus. We hear that chorus before we even hear any verse to set it up. And in that sense, that one song, I think, does not deliver.
Which is just a shame.
And it was the second single, if I'm not mistaken.
It was.
Yeah.
But yeah, the thing for me, though, is that I kind of feel bad for starting on such a negative note here, because especially because it's the middle part of the album. But as soon as "In the End" finishes, which I hate to say it, that piano, that simple piano outro for "In the End," I don't know what it is about that, but that still totally works for me.
Yeah. It's effective. I mean, you don't necessarily need to go highly technical and baroque to make a compelling through line for a song. It's so simple. It's like 5 notes, right? Down, 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 down.
That might have contributed to its popularity, because I definitely remember in elementary school, like, kids going up to a piano and playing out those notes.
Oh, sure.
Like, people who did not know how to play piano.
Yep. And the same thing happens with a lot of iconic hits. Like, how many people who don't play guitar, the first thing they want to learn is start playing Nirvana, because that's super simple. It's 4 power chords. If you do drop D tuning, you don't even need more than 1 finger to play that song.
Seriously?
Yeah. So music theory moment. If you're playing guitar...
Yeah, for what it's worth, some context here. John has been a pianist for, almost 30 years at this point?
Oh my gosh, you're right.
Yeah, he is a pianist. He is well-versed in music theory and music in general. I am not. I don't know how to play any musical instrument. And after 20 years of singing along to every song I like, I have somehow cobbled together something resembling a decent singing voice, but otherwise I don't have much in the way of leanings.
Yeah, so you're not big on the technical theory of it, but I think you have cobbled together enough musical knowledge to have a strong critical voice and some working understanding of how this stuff goes. So as a musical theory moment,
right.
When you're hearing kind of crunchy guitar melodies, like in Nirvana and like like there are at some points in this album. Usually what's going on there is it's power chords. And a power chord is actually just strung on, it's 3 strings of the guitar, and they're playing a 1, 5, 8. And the 1 and the 8 are in octave, so it's really only 2 notes. It's a 5th interval. And if you're in a metal band or a hard rock band and you find yourself playing a lot of these power chords, what you might do is take your lowest string, that low E, you tune it down 1 whole step. And that way you can do the bottom 3 notes of that guitar without even fretting them, and they're already playing that power chord, and then you can just slide 1 finger up and down those bottom 3 strings without having to worry about placement, and just move that finger as a whole up and down the neck to get the melody you want, which is how most people play Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Huh, didn't know that.
The bones of the song, the core, are really simple, and I think that's one of the key ingredients in a hit song like In the End, where you have something that's really at its base, it's not that complicated. It's easy to play. It's easy to understand, and then the complicated stuff comes in all on the margins. So that stuttering drum beat, Shinoda's lyrics, of course, and then just everything else the backing band is doing, the harmonics on the guitar, they're kind of lingering on these long notes to add emphasis and build mood, but not necessarily to do anything technically impressive. So I think those all come together really well, and especially after having more than a decade without getting much airplay, it's really easy to like In the End, and it's easy to see why it was such a big hit back in the day.
Okay, yeah. That all scans.
What were some other of the notes that stuck out to you?
But anyways, the point I wanted to make...
Oh, I'm sorry. I totally...
the point I was trying to start on about, 5-10 minutes ago, whatever, was that as soon as In the End finishes and Place for My Head starts, the album kicks back into high gear.
That's true, yeah.
And it just the flow of this album is just kind of amazing to me. Not always in a good way. In that it starts off really strong on Papercut.
Mm-hmm.
Papercut might be one of the best album openers and just career openers I've ever heard.
Yeah. It's not just a mission statement for the band.
It's a great song, but it's not just that.
Yeah.
It is a declaration of an intent. This is who we are.
Yes.
God, it's so good. And I hate myself for being terrified of it because of that stupid music video.
Yeah, they had that. The music video was like John Carpenter-esque. It had like faces coming out of the walls and stuff.
Yeah, and I was like 9 or 10 years old and absolutely terrified of it. And anytime I'd hear the song, it would remind me of the video. And I hated the song for so many years because of that. But oh my God, it is so good. And then it leads into One Step Closer, which is just another really good just a punching statement of this is the other end of who we are, and this is still really good. And then Points of Authority just kind of brings it all home before we get into that midway part of Crawling, Runaway, mm-hmm. By Myself, and In the End, where I with the benefit of hindsight, I just kind of go,
and then there was that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then as soon as In the End finishes, mm-hmm. Place for My Head kicks back up, and all the way to the end. It's just kind of great. I mean, again, with the benefit of hindsight, it's like, yeah, of course I love this. I was a kid, and this is all about, being misunderstood and rebelling. But that doesn't actually make any of it bad.
No, it doesn't make it bad. It does maybe make it less useful to us as adults. You're 28 years old. I'm 33.
It's definitely a good time capsule for me.
You're at 28 years old. I'm 33, and it is safe to say that if this were a new album today, we would not be the target audience for it.
Oh God, no. I would hear the single Papercut and go, man, I really want to check out more of this band. I would hear One Step Closer and go, I just don't think this is for me.
Especially, "Shut up when I'm talking to you" is one of those lines that was amazingly cathartic when you're a hormonal teenager who doesn't know what to do with all your emotions, but as an adult hearing that, you're like, that's kind of rude. That's...
I mean, for me, it's not even so much rude. It's just like, okay,
that's
children, calm down.
That's certainly not effective conflict management.
Yes, rap rock, the source of all of my conflict management skills.
Yes, I'm starting to think that maybe Chester Bennington, at all of, 22 years old when he recorded that album, perhaps didn't have a very high emotional intelligence.
Just to point out, he suffered abuse growing up.
That is a good point. Yes.
Yeah,
When that comes up, that
he
was...
has not exactly explicitly gone into too much detail about it, but he's
Yeah.
made it clear he grew up in an abusive environment. So just kind of want to put a note here that you might not want to talk about that
Yeah,
quite so
fair
lightly.
enough. That's maybe not the right words for the idea that I wanted to express. But
No, I know.
but yeah, I mean that abuse is very. It's definitely textual on this album. It's definitely something that comes up a lot, and it's sort of funny because when he took his own life in 2017, I remember reading about how he had come up in an abusive household and channeled that into his music, and I remember being a little surprised and then kind of kicking myself for being like, why is this a surprise? Listen to the music. It's right there. And especially in terms of dealing with conflict throughout the album by means of writing these songs. One thing that really struck me is when you listen to this album, you can really tell that it's more of a teenage sort of angst, a teenage or young adult sort of angst, just based on some of the lyrics. These are not adult conflicts. This is not, someone who's trapped in a failing marriage or something. This is definitely interpersonal conflict rooted in family of origin. I'm looking especially at track number 6, Runaway.
You point the finger at me again. I wanna run away, never say goodbye. I wanna know the truth instead of wondering why. I wanna know the answers, no more lies. I wanna shut down.
I feel like grown-ups don't necessarily think of running away. When you're an adult, you have a lot more autonomy over your own life. Running away is something that you do when you're under somebody else's thumb.
And adults, I don't think, tend to contextualize running away as running away. It's more abandoning.
That's another good
'Cause
point.
usually it's not about running away from something, but more about the things you're leaving behind.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so there are a couple of points like that, points of authority. Basically, the whole song is touching on that as well, where it's a conflict where there is an imbalance of power, where Bennington is the less powerful person, and he's feeling very frustrated about that. That comes up over and over again in the lyrics, to the point that I think is why it's so appealing to young people such as we were when we first
And
heard
I think
this.
it still holds true in some ways today. Like, I definitely feel myself flashing back to sort of that frame of mind a little bit when
Yeah.
I'm listening to this.
Yeah,
Sort of
yeah.
that feeling of powerlessness, and also sort of that feeling of, like, perhaps too finely tuned empathy or sympathy that just kind of makes you angry. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, like,
Yeah, kind
one
of.
of the recurring themes through this is just sort of like trying to relate to your own pain and being very frustrated by your inability to reconcile something that hurtful.
Yeah, and that's heavy. That's that's songwriting and heavy metal as therapy, which is definitely another big theme.
Yeah, and the music reflects it. I think it's kind of undersold just how much Shinoda's production and Johan's turntabling kind of gives it this sort of kinetic, almost unhinged feel to everything. Even though it is all
Yeah.
very tightly produced and put together, it still has this feeling like it's falling apart.
Interesting. Yeah, I never would have thought of Falling Apart as a description of this album's sonic quality, although there are definitely some hallmarks of the production style that stuck out to me, and I kind of wanted to save for a later part of this
Right.
discussion.
I mean, we still haven't gotten to the hit track part.
Yeah.
There was, I was going to say there is one other reason why I wanted to talk about this album. So, John mentioned earlier that this album was my choice to cover, and yeah, I went into the reasons before earlier, but there's one other reason I sort of held off on, which is that this was a really formative album for me growing up. But as I grew up, I kind of drifted away from Linkin Park. And it wasn't until about a year and a half ago when Chester Bennington took his life that that kind of changed the way I relate to public figures. Because as as I grew up and as their career continued, I disengaged pretty hard from Linkin Park. When Minutes to Midnight came out, I remember being really disappointed with that album. I remember thinking What I've Done was just kind of not a particularly great song. And I don't know if I ever necessarily thought of it as selling out, but, you know, I kind of came to think of Linkin Park as kind of a joke. Especially after Shinoda produced Fort Minor, like after he made that album. It became pretty clear to me that Shinoda wasn't the problem, and, you know, the band has two frontmen, and if one of them's not the problem, it's maybe the other one. And, you know, I mostly started thinking of Linkin Park as, and Chester Bennington especially, as, you know, the face of the band, as kind of a joke and a punchline. And, you know, I didn't resent them in any way. And, you know, on some level, I was still happy that, hey, the guys who made Hybrid Theory and Meteora, like, they're super successful, and, you know, I'm happy for them, but that's just not for me. And that sentiment and more aggressive and hostile variants of it were not exactly uncommon to my memory.
Oh, no, you
at
were
least-
definitely not the only one who felt that way. And in fact, the sales figures bear it out. Hybrid Theory came out in October of 2000 and was the highest selling album of 2000. It sold, I think, 6 million copies plus, you know. And every album since then, every subsequent Linkin Park album sold less than the one before it.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah, so when Bennington took his own life, I learned a little bit more about him. He apparently struggled with depression and self-loathing for a large part of his life, which, you know, the music bears out. And it's really hard for me to separate what I'm pretty sure was a really common sentiment, that, you know, they were sellouts, that they were kind of losers, that they were a joke, from what, you know, had to have been going through his head at the time that he took his life. And it's not to say that I personally bear any singular responsibility for his depression and his suicide, but that I was in a small part of a cultural thought that it would seem, it to me feels irresponsible to dismiss as a possibility of contributing to his suicide. Especially because as I was, like, researching this, one of the things that, like, really hit me kind of hard was the critical response to their last album, One More Light, and Bennington's response to that critical response, which was basically him lashing out in a very aggressive and hostile manner, and even threatening people who call them sellouts.
Oh, man. That sucks.
Yeah, and, you know, there have been a lot of, like, public figures who have taken their lives in our lifetimes. You know, I think Robin Williams is the first one that comes to mind.
Yep.
And, you know, even figures who have died in somewhat tragic circumstances, like, say, Prince or Michael Jackson, they're generally beloved figures. You know, like, it's there's not really a sense of, oh, if only we'd loved them more.
Yeah.
And Bennington's death was the first time I really started grappling with the notion that public figures are, people, and just because my thoughts and impressions are never going to make it to them doesn't mean that I shouldn't have some responsibility for those feelings.
That's fair. And that echoes a sentiment that I've been hearing from various other people I follow, that I think when we're young, we tend to be smug. We tend to make assumptions about other people, especially celebrities, and just kind of assume that they are a certain way, or that their career arc is going in a certain way, and that we control that narrative more than they do. And I've been noticing some critical pushback on that idea lately. So, for instance, people I follow on YouTube, Lindsay Ellis just did an extended apology to Stephanie Meyer for being so smug about those Twilight books. Following on that, Dan Olson did a series of what he called a lukewarm defense of the 50 Shades of Grey movies. And then Bob Chipman, who does reviews under Movie Bob, did a video in which he kind of excoriated his past self for being smug about the career arc of Kevin Smith.
The way Movie Bob put it was, who am I to put a 3-act structure on someone's life that's not even close to finished yet?
Exactly. And so what it comes down to is the thread that these three all have in common with what you're saying is kind of stepping back and examining the act of critical examination, and realizing that when you're doing that, I still think it's valuable to participate in critical examination of popular culture and the people who make it, but we should do so from a place where we're careful not to objectify them, and where we leave room in our hearts, I guess, to separate our reactions to a piece of art from speculation on the motivations of the people who made it.
I mean, I've definitely thought of a lot of things as sellouts throughout my life, and there are some things I definitely do still think that way about, but I kind of try to I try to keep a distance between some of the more irresponsible thoughts that I have versus the things I'm willing to put voice to.
Yeah, I hear you. And then there's a difference between, hey, I didn't care for Minutes to Midnight versus Linkin Park is a sellout for recording Minutes to Midnight.
Right.
It was a different direction. And one that I think was less effective. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are morally...
compromised?
Thank you, Harrison. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're morally compromised for having made it in the first place.
Right.
And I think when you're dealing with public figures, especially in the social media age where it's so easy to connect with people who make the things we love, it can be a danger that you can kind of get under somebody's skin by ascribing incorrect motivations or ascribing even moral failures to a piece of art that you just simply didn't like.
Hey, John, you're missing the very important point here. They used to make things that I like. Now they don't make things that I like. They're bad now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the important part.
Well,
they are morally failing.
Okay.
They are morally failing because of that.
For not catering to your personal taste.
To me specifically.
Oh,
my tastes matter.
Okay. That's true, they do. Your tastes are the most important tastes.
Anyways, not sure if that's gonna stay in.
No, I like that. That was a good defusing of that moment.
But there is sort of one other topic I wanted to touch on. It's really weird because as I was researching this, I was sort of like going back through the Linkin Park albums that I had at least given a cursory listen to. And one of their later albums that I actually enjoyed quite a bit was The Hunting Party.
Yeah.
Which I remember when I heard that album, I was kind of surprised. Like, holy crap, Linkin Park is back.
When you heard that album, I believe you were in my car at the time.
Yeah, I was really shocked.
You were visiting me, and I was like, hey, I hadn't listened to Linkin Park in years, but they just came out with a new album, and it's really good.
Well, I sort of found out a little bit about how that album was made. So I wasn't being complete in sort of my evaluation of Bennington before. So 5 or 6 years ago, actually, I forget the timeline exactly, but Stone Temple Pilots reunited and released an EP with Chester Bennington doing the vocals, and it
That's right.
was awesome.
I remember you liked that album a lot.
I was
It kinda
amazed at how
washed
much I
over
liked
me,
that
but-
album because I never even liked Stone Temple Pilots that much. And I was well into completely writing off Linkin Park and Chester Bennington as entertainers at that point. And when I heard that, I was blown away. Like that album was amazing. And it turns out that Bennington spent a pretty decent time recording that and touring with Stone Temple Pilots doing that album. And most of the Hunting Party was recorded, compiled, written, and produced without him. He came in at the more or less the final stretch to do his parts, and when he was promoting the album, he basically explained how this happened, and that when he came into this recording studio, he was like, "Holy crap, this is awesome! Like this stuff sounds great. I'm really excited to be doing this." And when I read that, it felt really weird because I wanted to do this episode about how Chester Bennington's suicide had sort of changed the way I think of and relate to public figures, and especially his reaction to criticism of their last album. But my favorite of their later albums happened mostly without his input, and it's really hard for me to like read all of that and hear that album and not think that, oh, maybe Chester Bennington was the problem, or maybe he had an outsized influence, because as a vocal talent he's incredible. He like that band does not work without his vocals, but as a creative force, maybe he was part of, not the problem, but part of my problem.
I hear you. I think that's interesting, and I think there's a mature way to voice that criticism, and to say, hey, maybe the fact that I really like this album and then later found out that Bennington wasn't really involved in most of it is evidence that I didn't care for Bennington's contributions to the album, which is a lot different from saying Bennington's a sellout, man.
Right.
You know?
And I do want to be very clear here. I do think that his talents as a vocalist do make the band, that the band does not work without his vocals.
Okay.
And that
yeah,
what I am
absolutely.
describing as, I'm not saying he should have never been in the band. But what I am saying is that it does feel that when he is more a part of the creative process of the band, I enjoy the work they make less.
Okay.
Which, it feels kind of
Right.
mean to say that after he has taken his
Well,
life and after my reaction to that.
I mean, if it's how you feel, man, I don't think that's necessarily mean or any more or less mean in the context of his suicide.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think that's a good segue for us to sort of conclude on this album. And the first question that we're going to ask each other at the end of each album is, Harrison, did you like it?
Oh yeah, it's a little weird because certain parts of it have definitely have not aged well. Like there are certain, and not even like individual songs, but just certain hallmarks of production that just kind of haven't aged well, or that are very clearly late '90s, early aughts in terms of their sound.
Yeah.
But oh my god, the whole package is just so great. Like, I still think Meteora is a better album, but the highs of Hybrid Theory are higher than anything Meteora does. Admittedly, its lows are also lower. But, God,
Yeah.
I really did enjoy listening to this and listening to this again, especially the first 4 tracks and the last 4 tracks.
Cool.
How about you, John? Did you like it? I know you were a bit more lukewarm to the idea of this album than I was, given that it was my suggestion.
I had. I'm going to answer your question with a question.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be kind of a digression, something I meant to discuss earlier in our discussion here. So we know after this album, they put out that remix album. They toured with Jay-Z. Shinoda did a lot of work after this to kind of buff up his rap resume, so to speak. But at this point, in the year 2000, do you think Shinoda's a good rapper at this point?
Oof. Yes. The short answer is yes. But there
right.
is a certain raw quality.
Uh-huh.
There's a certain unrefined quality to his rapping.
Yeah.
He has a very good sense of flow. And he doesn't seem to have any particular theme he's trying to hold on to as a rapper.
Okay. So one of the things that struck me about the character of this album as a whole, there are a few kind of production tricks on this album that make up what we think of as the Linkin Park sound. And they're employed in such a way that I don't think Shinoda is a bad rapper per se, but these are some techniques that I've noticed that could, if he maybe were not confident in his own abilities as a rapper, that he might be deploying to sort of mask that.
I have no idea what you're referring to. Please elaborate.
Yeah, so let's get into it. Yeah, absolutely. So number one, first and foremost, audio doubling or vocal doubling. Having recorded some songs myself, I have a little bit of the toolkit needed to recognize and explain all this. When you're in a vocal booth, you record an audio track, and it goes in as one row on basically the flowchart of the song. And then you can say, okay, go back to the beginning. I'm going to record that vocal track again without deleting the original. So now you've got two takes of the exact same vocal being played at the same time. And it's a really common technique throughout music. You'll hear it all over tons of different radio songs. It's especially notable here in Hybrid Theory because literally every single time you hear Shinoda's voice, it's doubled. Every single time on this album.
I think at some point I just sort of
especially
internalized that that's what his voice sounds like.
Which is why when Minutes to Midnight came out and he had that one single,
Bleed It Out.
It was the only, Bleed It Out, which was the only rap song on the entire album, if I recall. He comes out with his voice much less adorned than on the first two albums, and it's very striking because he's really holding his own as a rapper. It feels like he leveled up on that album. But here in this first album, he's always doubling his voice. And the other technique that really struck me was his heavy use of the stutter edit.
I would argue that that's less him and more Han.
Oh yeah, okay.
I mean, I don't. Neither of us know for sure, but I would argue that is less something he chose to do, and something more that Han did, because that's all over that album, just all over the sound and the music of it. Even Bennington's lyrics get stuttered at one point or another.
Okay, because when Shinoda does it, I really notice it, especially like. There's one in the end, which you can't help but notice because it was on the radio all over the place, where he says,
in spite of the way you were mocking me, acting like I was part of your property.
It's an interesting tool to use in this context. One of the reasons it's interesting is because it's a production trick that cannot be done by a turntablist. Or rather, I mean, if Mr. Han is doing it, it can be done by a turntablist, but it can't be done on a turntable.
Right.
I'm pretty sure Aphex Twin was the one who really kind of pioneered this technique. You hear it in a lot of Fatboy Slim songs where something is resampled faster and faster and faster until it's obvious to the listener that only a computer could be doing this.
Right.
And it's part of the soundscape that makes up this album, this kind of thrash metal meets industrial meets rap. but I wonder how integrated it was into Shinoda's rap performances. Like when there's that stutter beat over the middle T and proper T, did he know that that was going to happen, and did he adjust his performance accordingly? Or perhaps was that stutter beat put in there to mask a point where he had fallen off the flow? I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it did.
Huh. I've never really thought of production as compensating for his rapping on this album. I mean, it is obvious if you listen to the arc of Linkin Park's career that Shinoda has improved as a rapper, and that he probably more than anyone else in the band has had the largest arc of improvement through his career.
Yeah, and that's interesting because even here at the beginning, I think he's the MVP on this album by a pretty wide margin. I think the songs are good in proportion to how much of him there are in them. For the most part.
Kind of. Although I really, the way I would put this, if you give those lyrics to just about any other rapper, they could probably do a serviceable enough job. But if you give those vocals to any other singer, you would need a top-tier vocalist to match what Bennington is putting on this album. And I'm not just saying that to overcompensate for being kind of mean earlier. Like, he really does make this band.
Yeah. So this was a long digression to get around to the answer of, yes, I really do like this album, and I especially like it because of this soundscape that it puts together. Because
I think what you're highlighting in terms of Shinoda isn't so much that he is an insecure or not good enough yet rapper, but rather that he's not unique.
That's true.
Like, at this point, what makes him unique is that he is in a band like Linkin Park.
You're right. He doesn't have a distinct voice of his own, even in the songs that he carries the most.
Right.
In the End and Papercut.
And it's not until Meteora when he starts solidifying his own voice, after he had been touring with a lot of rappers, especially Jay-Z.
Yeah.
And then when he releases Fort Minor, that his sort of signature Shinoda sound and voice is solidified.
Okay, I hear that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great segue, having established that we both really like this album.
Yeah.
That's a great segue for us to start talking about what's your key track on this album. This is a segment that we're going to be doing for every album. Harrison and I have chosen independently a key track, which is a very arbitrary metric. It could be the best one, or it could be the most representative song, or just the one that stuck out the most. And we have not told each other what our picks are. So we're going to see if they match up.
So for me, I remember going into this album again and starting on Papercut and thinking, God, I would really hate to be so basic as to pick the first song, one of the singles from the album, but God, it is so good. And I'm very happy to say that it wasn't Papercut, even though Papercut is really good. And it was one of the 3 songs that I did try to narrow down. But it was all the P songs. Papercut, Points of Authority, and Place for My Head, and I eventually settled on Place for My Head because the theme of that song really hit home for me in a really personal way. I mean, all 3 of them do. Papercut is basically about paranoia. Points of Authority is about dealing with abuse in one fashion or another. But Place for My Head is literally a song about being surrounded by people in your life that you cannot relate to. Presumably family in this case. That no matter how hard you try, you just cannot wrap your head around them. And that hits home for me in a really powerful way. And it's also just got some really compelling imagery. It's sometimes it's kind of sophomoric, and I guess your mileage might vary, but just the way it opens, I watch how the moon sits in the dark night, shining with the light from the sun. That's powerful, even if it's not necessarily, good in your opinion.
In my opinion?
Well, no, what I'm saying is like whether or not you think that is that's a good couplet to open a song on. That's referring to the moon and the sun. That's powerful imagery. So, anyways,
Sure.
what was your track of the week?
Hey, guess what?
Do you need?
It's a match.
Was it
yeah,
was it
A Place
was
for
it
My
as
Head
hard a
was
choice for you as it was for me?
A Place for My Head was also my pick. Papercut was also a close second for me. And really, I was listening to Papercut on the first listen and thinking, boy, nothing might top this.
Yeah.
And it was A Place for My Head that did it for me. And I think part of it is that novelty effect that I was talking about earlier, that if it's the one that you don't remember as much from your last listen, it might be a little bit more powerful to you. And that's definitely true. But I really just love Shinoda's lyricism here. Not just that opening couplet about the moon and about the moon shining with the light from the sun, but how that becomes a metaphor in the following couplet, which is, and the sun doesn't give light to the moon, assuming the moon's gonna owe it one.
Yeah.
That really hung with me. I think it's Shinoda's best lyricism on the album. The flow is great, and then when Bennington comes in with that chorus, it really seals the whole thing home for me.
I'm so hungry I could ride a horse. I don't get it.
That on top of everything else you said, it makes it the key track for me as well. So here we have a bingo, Yahtzee, Double Jeopardy, Tetris, whatever you want to call this. We matched.
That's number one.
Yay! What do you know?
Yep.
It's going to be pretty interesting in the coming weeks as we do more and more of these. Because I don't expect that we're always going to line up really well, but it is hard for me to deny that a lot of my taste in music was directly influenced by you.
Yeah, I hear you. And you know what's
and
interesting?
This is
I didn't think we were going to match up on this
like
one.
that, where we hit it at the same time. And it came out when we were both kids. We both were into it more or less at the same time. So that kind of surprises me. I mean, that doesn't surprise me that we kind of hit on the same things.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, there's a 5-year gap between me and John. I'm not sure if we've even mentioned that we're brothers yet. Well, we've mentioned our last names.
We may have forgotten that. Yeah. I did say our ages earlier
yeah,
in the
but yeah,
cast,
so there's 5 years between us, and for the most part, for a large part of my childhood, I'm literally listening to the music that John's listening to. There's not much else.
The reverse happened sometimes, but it was mostly me picking the music and Harrison going along with it. For what it's worth, I'm surprised. I thought I was picking kind of a deep cut, and I didn't think we would line up on this one.
Mm-hmm.
But next week, I think there's a higher chance that we're going to line up. We'll see how that goes. Next week, the album that we're discussing is one that I chose, and having started off with the best-selling album of the year 2000, I figured we'd go obscure and listen to an album by this British quartet called the Beatles.
Less miserables?
We are... I'm not even going to pretend we're not swinging for the fences and going broad on episode 2. We're going to be discussing Magical Mystery Tour, the late 1967 album by the Beatles, who you may have heard of. And, we talk about...
I'm just going to interrupt here to give a little context here. John and I do have pretty similar taste in music, as I was just saying, but John's tastes... John has a much stronger preference for traditional rock music than I do.
I feel a little guilty about being such a fan of the music that mostly British white men stole from black men, but... I'm not. I have a little white guilt over it, but the fact is, classic rock is very much my comfort music.
Oh yeah,
and the Beatles are very foundational on that. I don't know if they're my personal favorite band, but I definitely understand that they are probably the most important rock band period. And I'm very familiar with their catalog. And Magical Mystery Tour is actually my favorite Beatles album, which is why I picked it, because I wanted to discuss kind of the value of favorites and the difference between that and a critical best album.
Okay.
So we're going to be talking about that next week here on Play Disc. And here's where we awkwardly segue into our ending. Thank you for listening if you made it this far. I'd like to thank our good friend Ben Wright Human for providing promotional art for us. You can find more of his work at bwhcomics.com if you'd like. If you wish to email us, our address is playdiscpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook under the name Playdisc Podcast and on Twitter as @playdiscpodcast.
Hey, John, is disc spelled with a K or a C in that email address?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's a C. So it's PLAYDISC podcast@gmail.com or at Facebook or at Twitter. If you'd like to be so generous as to support us financially, we have a page set up on Patreon, which you can access at patreon.com/playdiscpodcast. We're working on setting up our donation tiers and incentives, so we welcome your input on what those should be. Looking forward to hearing from you all, and tune in 2 weeks for our episode about the Beatles. Until then,
catch all you guys on the B-side.
oh, that's terrible. We're going to do that every episode now, aren't we?
Oh, God.
And now a quick word on copyright. Today's episode used clips from several Linkin Park songs, namely Papercut, One Step Closer, Crawling, In the End, Points of Authority, and A Place for My Head. These songs are all written and performed by Linkin Park, copyright 2000, and rights to the recordings are owned by Warner Bros. Warner Music Group. We also used a short clip from Smells Like Teen Spirit, written and performed by Nirvana, copyright 1991. The rights to Smells Like Teen Spirit are owned by David Geffen Company and Universal Music Group. We've used short clips for purposes of commentary without formal licensing as allowed under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, also known as fair use. The Playdisc theme song was written and recorded by me under my stage name John Eric, and all other aspects of the Playdisc podcast are jointly owned by myself and Harrison Porabil, and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 International License. Playdisc!